Perhaps someone might say, "But Socrates, if you leave us, will you not be able to live quietly without talking?" This is the most difficult point to convince some of you. If I say it is impossible for me to keep quiet, it means disobeying the God, and you may not believe me. On the other hand, if I say it is the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, you will believe me even less. For the unexamined life is not worth living for man.
All right, hi, I'm Chris Blakely. I'm the instructor for this class, and here we, here we have the first lecture. It's a general introduction to philosophy. So people show up to philosophy classes usually without much exposure to the discipline at all. Maybe they've read an existentialist in maybe a high school English class, or come across some philosophy on their own. But usually folks come to a philosophy class just without any formal exposure to the discipline. And so what I want to do today is just give a little bit of an overview of academic philosophy primarily. That's what we're going to be studying in the class. So, what is philosophy? We would like a simple definition here, but unfortunately we're not going to get one. This term philosophy is used in many different ways. Some of which have to do with what we'll do in this course, some of which maybe not so much. One place to begin is just with the English term philosophy, which means love of wisdom. It comes from two Greek words, Sophia and Philia, that make up philosophy, the love of wisdom, right? Another way you might see the term philosophy being used is as an overall strategy, a first principle, or a mindset. I have a Google alert for philosophy, and most of the hits in that Google alert, have to do with like football defensive and offensive coaching philosophies. Not exactly what we're going to be doing here, but you might hear that term philosophy being used in that way in business to reflect someone's approach, a general mindset or approach to how they conduct business, or a strategy for their business. You might also hear philosophy talked about as a kind of a way of life. That's very closely related to that idea of the love of wisdom in ancient Western philosophy. That's what philosophy was known as, is primarily a way of life, not an academic discipline. You might hear the term philosophy being used with reference to self-help or therapy even. Just the other day, yesterday in fact, in my news feed was an article from, I think it was the New Yorker or New York Magazine, talking about philosophy as a form of therapy, where philosophers have tried to show that many of the psychological problems people encounter are really philosophical problems, and have begun offering philosophical counseling to people as a service. Another thing that another way that you might hear philosophy being used, that term being used, is with reference to a particular school of thought, or a particular philosophy like conservatism, liberalism, Marxism, socialism, theism, polytheism, atheism, naturalism. All of these are different schools of thought which are defined by the way they give basic answers to some fundamental philosophical questions and then work from there. And then, of course, we're studying philosophy as an academic discipline, and so that's what we're primarily going to be concerned with. And as an academic discipline, we can kind of specify some more things about philosophy. If you just were to Google the term philosophy, here's what might come up, and you see here it means that it's the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, existence, specifically when considered as an academic discipline. And then some of the other definitions that I just mentioned pop up below that, right? So the lexical definition here, the dictionary definition of philosophy, gives us the idea that it's a theoretical discipline dealing with foundational conceptual issues. And then picking up a little bit further on that notion of philosophy as a way of life, we have Socrates, who many people have heard of, likely heard of, or Confucius, right? And they talked about philosophy as the pursuit of wisdom. Socrates famously remarked in Plato's Apology that the unexamined life is not worth living, and philosophy is the examined life. And Confucius mentioned that the noblest way to achieve wisdom is through reflection. So off the bat here, we get the idea of philosophy as a way of life, a reflective life, the life of examination, examining our beliefs and our practices and our customs and our habits, and critically questioning received opinion. Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher. Stoicism's really big on the internet right now. You might come across some stuff about that if you were just looking around philosophy on the internet or on YouTube. He remarks that, behold the beginning of philosophy, a recognition of the conflict between the opinions of people, a search for the origin of that conflict, a skepticism regarding it, a kind of investigation to determine whether the opinion is rightly held. Easy to have an opinion, more difficult to figure out which opinion is rightly held. And later in the semester, actually in the next couple of lessons, we'll start to talk about what it would mean to have a rightly held opinion, a justified conclusion versus maybe just a mere expression of opinion. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Here we have Wittgenstein, a famous 20th century philosopher, who said that philosophy is the battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by the means of language. We live in an environment in which language is often manipulated and used in suspect ways that influences how we think. And so Wittgenstein, who was very interested in language, thought that one of the things that philosophy did is help clarify our language and help us to resolve problems. So again, the idea of escaping illusion and through clarification and critical thinking. Gilles Deleuze, another 20th century philosopher from a very different school of thought than Wittgenstein, and in one of his books on another philosopher, Nietzsche, he wrote that philosophy does not serve the state or the church, who have other concerns. It serves no established power. The use of philosophy is to sadden. A philosophy that saddens no one, that annoys me. It's not a philosophy. It's useful for harming stupidity, for turning stupidity into something shameful. So again, we get this idea that philosophy is about, escaping illusion and critical thinking. MacIntyre, a very different philosopher from the last two that we've seen, very influential in the virtue ethics field and in moral philosophy. And in one of his books called After Virtue, that many people have commented on as well, he says that man is essentially a storytelling animal, but a teller of stories that aspire to truth. So most people, they don't just want to have opinions, they want to have beliefs that are true, right? And so that quotation picks up on that idea. Then we get Simon Blackburn, who is a contemporary philosopher as well. This comes from his little book, Think, which is an introduction to philosophy. And I got two quotations from him out of this book. I just really like them, and I think they're very useful for getting across what philosophy is about. So he says, the word philosophy carries unfortunate connotations, impractical, unworldly, weird. I suspect that all philosophers and philosophy students share that that moment of silent embarrassment when someone innocently asks what we do. I'd prefer to introduce myself as doing conceptual engineering. For just as the engineer studies the structure of material things, so the philosopher studies the structure of thought. Understanding that structure involves seeing how the parts function and how they interconnect. It means knowing what would happen for better or for worse if changes were made. This is what we aim at when we investigate the structures of our thought that shape our view of the world. Concepts or ideas are the mental housing in which we live. So again, that notion of the examined life, critical thinking, and seeing the relationships between ideas. He follows that up with this. He says, we might wonder whether what we say is objectively true or merely the outcome of our own perspective or our own take on a situation. Thinking about this, we confront categories like knowledge, objectivity, truth. We may want to think about them, and at that point we're reflecting on concepts and procedures and beliefs that we normally just use. We're looking at the scaffolding of our thought and doing conceptual engineering. So it gets his line there gets across this idea that doing philosophy involves thinking about assumptions that we usually just take for granted. And then here's a textbook definition of philosophy. It comes from a textbook called Classic Questions in Contemporary Film. I've used this textbook for many years, and although I'm not using it right now, I often still assign a chapter out of it or some selections out of the introductory chapter there. And here we have kind of a more technical textbook definition of academic philosophy. And Klosowski writes, it's the intellectual activity of attempting to discern and remove contradictions among non-empirical reasoned beliefs that have universal importance with the resulting benefit of achieving a greater understanding of the world and our place within it. And then over here I have a little silly cartoon where philosophers are all agreeing about how important philosophy is, but arguing over the definition of philosophy. So while I like this textbook definition of philosophy, I think it captures a lot of what goes on in academic philosophy. It's not without its problems, and it's not, unquestionable itself. Then I probably assigned a reading for you to do today. It might have had to do with pop culture. I like to use this article on flatulence in philosophy in South Park, and there are several key things that they pick up on in that article about the relationship between South Park at its best, at least, and what Socrates and what philosophy is like. So there were similarities between the two. Both are criticized for being useless or corrupting the youth. The article mentions Socrates' defense through rational argumentation of the charges against him, corrupting the youth, and impiety were two of those charges. It emphasized the idea that philosophy deals with conceptual questions and dialogue and discussion about those conceptual issues. And then it also mentions, Arendt's notion of thoughtlessness, and how that Cartman from South Park kind of exemplifies the kind of thoughtlessness that Arendt associated with what she called the banality of evil, and how Kyle and Stan are more like Socrates and more reflective. And so we get the idea from that article that philosophy and South Park are against thoughtlessness. Philosophy is against, as the examined life is against thoughtlessness in her special sense of the term there. And so some other common themes out of those quotations. We get this idea that philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom and the escape from falsehood, illusions, deception. It uses unaided human reason to try to accomplish that. It involves questioning received ideas, popular opinion, and it's against the uncritical acceptance of beliefs. The idea, again, from Blackburn, that everybody has philosophical beliefs, in that sense, in a special sense, that you probably couldn't get up in the morning if you didn't have some philosophical beliefs about the value of life and being motivated to do certain things, and the importance and significance you attach to them. And those beliefs probably influence, both who you think you are as a person, but often make claims that are not merely about you as a person. They make claims that aspire to, as McIntyre said, aspire to truth or universality and objectivity. So it does emphasize, philosophical beliefs do have that component to them. They're universally significant, and they purport to be objective, and not merely matters of personal opinion. We also got the idea that philosophy involves independent, critical, reflective, methodological, and logical thinking. And again, we'll get do a little bit of work on some basic logic here at the beginning of the semester. And so, just to wrap up, we get this basic idea that there's a distinction between believing on the basis of good reasons and evidence versus believing on insufficient or bad reasoning. That's probably one of the most important distinctions in philosophy as an activity, as a way of life, and as an academic discipline. The subfields of academic philosophy are numerous, but there are a few basic ones. Logic, study of good and bad reasoning; epistemology, the study of the theory of knowledge. So that quote from Blackburn says we, may reflect upon our conceptions of knowledge. We all claim to know things, but what do we mean by knowledge exactly? How do we distinguish that from lucky guesses or mere opinion? Metaphysics deals with the nature of reality. So again, the way reality isn't just a matter of my personal preferences, right? And then it deals with values as well. Moral and political philosophy, questions like how ought I live, what ought I do, what's the ideal form of society, what is justice, what are the limits of freedom. All these sorts of things are wrapped up with our values about human conduct and how we relate to each other, as well as how we shape our own lives. And then aesthetic values, values and questions about the nature of beauty and aesthetic sensibilities and preferences in the realm of art and what we find pleasurable. And then you probably also maybe study a little bit of the history of philosophy, where you look at the past mistakes of philosophers so we don't repeat them. And then here I have a list of other subfields of academic philosophy, which usually intersect with some of those basic subfields on the left-hand side, but since there's such robust research going on in those areas, they kind of have their own further subfields, like the philosophy of mind, which is basically a subfield of metaphysics. Philosophy of religion deals with both epistemological, metaphysical, as well as ethical issues related to religion. Philosophy of science, how do we define science? How do we distinguish it in a principled way from non-science or pseudoscience? Just about any area of inquiry that raises conceptual issues that aren't examined by that discipline itself would count as a philosophy of that discipline. So a lot of it really is a broad spectrum of things. It's difficult to, if you're skeptical about philosophy and you think it doesn't have anything to do with you, I can guarantee you if I talk to you for long enough, I can find a philosophical belief that you think is very important to you and show you what philosophers have spent time thinking about, have said about that issue. And so here's an example of a typical philosophical debate that we see pop up in many areas of philosophy. Some of those basic subfields we just looked at. It's debates over realism versus anti-realism. And just very quickly, realism, as the name implies, says that there's some objective, mind-independent reality that is, independent of my own personal preferences and exists independent of my personal preferences. And anti-realism is, it's an invention. It's not a discovery. It's an invention or a construction, or it's something that we project onto the world. So we see that kind of debate pop up in epistemology, metaphysics, and in value fields. So the example question down at the bottom here is: are there any moral values or truths that are objective and universal, or are all moral values relative, subjective, or just social constructions or something like that, made up, invented again? It's a fundamental question in metaethics.
And his great-grandpa was Thomas Griffin, a great philosopher.
Thomas, would you please go look for a job?
Why?
So, and then here, just to wrap up a little bit, people, like I mentioned at the outset, people show up to philosophy class often without very much exposure to it as a formal discipline, but may have, come across it casually, and, you just show up with often people show up with lots of, what I would call misconceptions of philosophy that often color their expectations about what will be expected of them, about what they'll do in a philosophy class, what the academic expectations will be in a philosophy class. And so, it's not just about expressing your opinion, as I've tried to emphasize already. It is about producing arguments. It's about studying arguments and trying to evaluate arguments to determine which arguments for different philosophical positions are better or worse, logically speaking, and on the merits of those arguments. And so that's what we'll be up to most of the semester, is doing that sort of thing. And so why should you study this discipline? Why do I think it's a good idea for you to do it? Why would it be required at a university to get a degree, even if you're not majoring in philosophy? Well, one of the things is that a university degree, a college degree, it's not just about professional training, it's about producing an educated citizenry as well. And so we want a citizenry, of course, that knows how to debate issues on principle together so that we can have a decent society. So one of the reasons why you ought to study philosophy is to learn about influential philosophical views, arguments, and ideas that are often relevant to public debate, public policy debate, for example, or important social matters. It'll help you improve critical thinking, logical reasoning, and communication skills. I think one of the most practical things you get out of studying philosophy is like a little bit of logic goes a long way. A little bit of critical thinking goes a long way. It's a good major if you want to go to law school or some other graduate program where research, oral argumentation, and presentation, and being able to formulate and communicate ideas is important. Argumentation is central in philosophy. It's central in law as well. And it's a good major for learning how to out-argue your roommate. And so a little bit of just a little fun thing there at the end, but it's still true. So this, my goal here is just to provide you a little bit of an overview, a little brief introduction and overview into what we'll be doing this semester to try and give you an idea of how we'll be approaching the various topics that we cover over the semester. So this ends the first lecture here. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.